Thank you to the American Red Cross. This is amazing. Thank you to the students. I am so sad that I am old and not a student anymore, because I would love to be going through something like that. And thank you to Civic too. I mean, being here tonight actually feels like speaking in my own living room to my family, because I know so many of you, and it's like being with family. So I think that the American Red Cross had me come tonight because I am not a lawyer. So it's something a little bit different for this crowd. I do like to drop ex gratia and lex specialis anytime I can, just to confuse people, but I did not actually get a law degree. And I think that why they asked me here was because I use international humanitarian law in my daily work and have for 20 years, because I focus on the practical practice side of doing this in battle zones. So I want to start with a quote from Samuel Huntington in 1993. He said that a military force is fundamentally anti-humanitarian. Its purpose is to kill people in the most efficient way possible. I think he got that wrong, because in fact, the American military and many others around the world actually protect people while they are targeting others. And that's because of the law, for sure. But it has to do with a lot of other things as well. There is something more, because what the United States, which I will probably focus most of my remarks on, has realized in the past 2 decades is that not putting law into practice leaves us with less credibility as a nation, less legitimacy for the actions we want to take overseas, and fewer partners. It really makes a tougher sell when we feel we want to use military action. So when I talk to the US military, which I do now on a daily basis just by turning left or right, they all say that the Geneva Conventions are tattooed on their souls. I think that's probably true for those who have served in Iraq and Afghanistan. They get why this is important, but consider all of the other things they've learned beyond the law. And they've learned these things the hard way in Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, elsewhere. They've had to daily struggle with winning the population, winning legitimacy, or winning the mission that has created a whole host of policies and guidance. Consider some of the things that you may or may not know about in US policy. Executive order on civilian casualties, presidential policy guidance on drones, the executive order on detentions, tactical directives that were put in place in various places that saved civilian lives, interagency meetings on civilian harm and civilian casualty incidents. These sound so boring, I know, but they're not. It is through those very things that we show the world that we're serious when we say that rule of law is a strategic interest and an ethical staple of American action. They also happen to save lives, so I think we're all on board with saying that they're important. So getting back to these amazing young people who will take over the fight when the rest of us get too tired, which is coming. There are 3 questions that I would ask them coming out of this exercise. First, you can translate law into any language, but will your message be clear in a life or death moment when it really matters? Second, legal text can become good actions on the ground, but can you get those good actions back into the text for the future? Third, upholding international law in practice makes us who we are as Americans, Africans, Brits, Aussies. So what now in 2017? So first, translating law into life or death moments. When I was visiting military installations in Las Vegas, California, Alabama, Afghanistan, Somalia, commanders would tell me, what are you suggesting I cut from my curriculum in order to get your issues in? This was usually not said with a smile. They saw the practical training on civilian protection, human rights, detention issues as a nice add-on. It was ornamental to the fundamentals. And when it comes to military strategy, the thing is they couldn't be more wrong. What happens, for example, when the Nigerian forces that we're training abuse their own civilians? Consider the irony here. Nigeria's military is fighting Boko Haram, a group specifically known for abusing its civilians. Our State Department and the United Nations are pouring many, many dollars into trying to get rid of corruption, bolstering the rule of law, in some getting the government to treat its civilians well so that Boko Haram can't take hold. Who wins if Nigerian civilians feel they are losing at the hands of their own military? Similarly, when Saudi forces kill civilians in Yemen, Washington is forced to reconsider not only its support for the war, but its entire relationship with a long-held ally. Human rights groups surely blamed Saudi Arabia for civilian casualties, but they also blamed Washington and London too. Perhaps more importantly, so did the Yemeni people, because in a 24/7 media world, everyone knows where the support comes from. And if you're a Yemeni civilian living under Saudi bombardment, you may reconsider where to throw your support. And the thing is, civilian casualties caused by Saudi may be a violation of international law, or it may be a legitimate action that caused collateral damage. Either way, the political fallout can't be in anyone's interest, and that's why we have to care not only about the law, but exactly how it's implemented, both politically, ethically, and strategically. So I was in northern Iraq prior to the Mosul liberation operation, and I heard again and again from people who knew this population, who had studied it for decades, that the dignity of the Mosulawis was the most important thing when conducting this operation, more important than killing ISIS fighters, even though killing ISIS fighters was perfectly within the law, even if you caused civilian harm. So it wasn't a legal consideration that Iraqi forces were undertaking here, it was political, ethical, strategic. Thankfully, the Iraqi forces, when they liberated East Mosul, did take this into consideration, and they did protect civilian lives. Now they're going into West Mosul, which is a much more complicated urban environment. They have to sit back and rethink this. Are they going to once again heed that call, that the dignity of the Mosulawis is more important than what they can do under international law? Another response I heard from commanders at these training centers was, "Ma'am, we already train on the laws of war, so we're good, thanks." Teaching the text of the Geneva Conventions or the Declaration of Human Rights has never proved sufficient. And if anyone has an example that disputes this, I would love to hear it. But this is one of the things that the students are learning by having to go through these tabletop exercises, by going through these scenarios, that the text is not enough. So when a new recruit recites the principles of distinction, we cheer. But put that exact man on a dirt road with a hasty checkpoint, meaning it was just set up, and an old beat-up car speeding toward him. Is it a suicide bomber or is it a pregnant couple trying to get to the hospital? He's not gonna know by knowing the Geneva Conventions. He'll only know what to do and not be too scared to do it if he's practiced the principle of distinction over and over again. Only if his commander has taught him what it means to assume that unknown people are civilian, and only if his rules of engagement give him a clear escalation of force measures that keep civilians alive. So all of those things require that US trainers dig beyond the law and into best practice, because it's not only about what you can do, but what should you do? And that's the practical application. Second, the question about legal text becoming good action, but can you get that good action back into the text? This is basically, okay, great, you just turned water into wine. Can you turn it back again? So good practices on the battlefield can certainly save lives. I've seen it. That's a good end in and of itself, but wouldn't it be better if they lived past that day, if they lived past the next rotation of Army recruits coming in, or if they lived past that commander who is so good and really gets it going to his retirement ceremony? Otherwise, the good practices die. So let me tell you about some good practices and then what happened next. You're probably familiar by now with the classic story of 2009 counterinsurgency General McChrystal. So he saw that civilian casualties were causing a really big problem politically, on the ground. President Karzai was saying, we're not going to partner with the US anymore because of civilian casualties. Afghans were chanting death to America in the streets. Bad situation. He put in place tactical directives. These are based on the principles of international law, but they told the soldiers what they could and could not do in a very practical way. he got the rate of civilian casualties down significantly. In Iraq, General Corelli saw that there were a lot of civilians being killed at checkpoints. This was circa 2005, 2006. So he had his team look at it. What's going on here at these checkpoints? They kept the data, they tracked what was happening, and they figured out that it was really the hasty checkpoints, the one that were set up really quickly, that were killing civilians. He made some adjustments, civilian harm went down. Those are the best practices that then became the executive order on civilian harm that we all applauded last year. They became new Army manuals on civilian harm that are being trained as we speak, new trainings. And these best practices became people within the State Department and the Department of Defense who actually have civilian harm in their formal portfolios. This stuff really matters the next time we go into a conflict. Now, another example. NATO did all of those things in Afghanistan, and they got really good at acknowledging civilian harm. They knew that if you left civilians without any acknowledgement of the suffering that they'd been through, that would cause them problems. Fast forward to the Libya operation. NATO would not admit to civilian harm, yet they had learned the lesson in Afghanistan. The problem was it wasn't written down anywhere. They didn't turn the good practice into policy. They didn't turn it back around. And so their legitimacy really took a hit when they kept saying, no, we didn't cause any civilian casualties, even when faced with factual evidence that they did. So my big point is that it's not enough to turn law into practice. You gotta put it back. And finally, what now? This is a more sort of existential conversation that we could talk about all night, but I won't. It seems as if winter may be coming when it comes to international law. As I noted when we began, the United States has thrown its weight behind good policies and practices when it comes to taking IHL out of the books and into the battlefield. So let's look at what's going on in the rest of the world. Russia's training separatists in eastern Ukraine. They don't have a very good record of IHL. Iran is arming and funding Hezbollah in Lebanon, training a whole range of actors in Iraq and Syria. Sri Lanka killed civilians on their beaches in 2009 and called it a successful counterterrorism operation, and then began going around to ministers of defense conferences and training up the Pakistanis and others. So the way that I look at the world right now is that it's a fight between those nations and peoples who believe in rule of law and those that don't. And we have to counter the more brutal and cynical narrative that's emerging all over the world about the best way to win a war, one that treats civilians and human rights as irrelevant, or that can be thwarted in order to win. As one of the world's leading exporters of military ethos, I strongly believe the United States can and should provide a counterweight to the bad actors. But the fact is that leadership on rule of law, human rights, civilian protection, the way that we care about humanity in the worst of times begins right here at home. Now we finally, as a public, and this has happened in a lot of publics around the world, we finally last year had a conversation about this, about these principles, about the way to fight and how we were going to fight. It was during the election season. And unfortunately, I don't think it ended very well. The fact is, if terrorists can force us to act like they do, then they've leveled the moral playing field, and they've taken away one of our best advantages in this fight. Consider that Abu Ghraib became one of the most effective recruiting tools for terrorists and insurgents in Iraq. And I don't think that most Americans understand what's at stake here. An American trainer in Uganda or Tunisia will have a very tough time making the case for good practices based on IHL. Who are we, after all, to mentor other forces on such needless principles and practices if we ourselves eschew them? So as a community of people who care about IHL, I think we have some decisions to make. First, we could plug along, trying to improve US and allied policies and practices wherever we can, hopefully saving lives, again, a very good end in and of itself, and continuing good precedent. That path will be harder now, but we should still do it. Second, we could take a bigger picture view and stand firm that the current global order, the one created after World War II, is in America's best interest and will work to protect it. The third option, a bit of a nuclear option, if you don't mind the term, we could take a look at the global order and consider whether it's time for an upgrade, since so many forces are competing to pull it apart right now. Maybe we, as a community, want to be on the cutting edge and set our own terms for what a new framework would look like. So I throw those three options out there, not offering my preference. Some of them can be done even while others are being done, but we have to make a decision about how we are going to act, because certainly not acting is not an option. And frankly, I, for one, am actually looking forward to this tension in our community, because that's when the good ideas come about. Speaking of good ideas, let's follow the example of our students. Let's throw ourselves back into debate and discussion on why the books and the practices matter, who they protect, and how we're going to make the case that we're better off with IHL than without it. Thank you.